Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed the evening so far. I have the daunting task of introducing our speaker. At least 25 years ago, I was talking to Don Mead, and he just happened to mention, like Don does, that Merlin Holland was writing a book. We wondered when we could get him to speak about this book to the Oscar Wilde Society at a birthday dinner. Well, it's a few years later, but that day has finally come, and we couldn't be more delighted. Those who've had the pleasure of reading the book already will know that it's been well worth the wait. It's full of meticulous detail, fascinating history, and indeed many, many surprises. It's always been difficult to say anything about Merlin which hasn't been said before. But with this book, we're now able to celebrate Merlin Holland, the author. And what a wonderful writer and teller of stories he is. Merlin, we're delighted and honoured to have you here speaking to us this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, Merlin Holland.
Vanessa, thank you very much indeed. I think I repeat myself from last year when you introduced me. I have taken a very long time, as you know, to write this book. And one of the reasons for it has been that for many years I have criticised other people's biographies and studies of Oscar for their sloppy research, for their inventions and their myth-making, and the danger of writing about such matters is that you've damn well got to get it right yourself. And if you don't, somebody, probably one of the authors of the biographies that I've criticised, is certainly going to take you to task for it. I thought I'd tell you a bit about the how and the why of writing this book. There will be some of you here tonight who have perhaps attended, I know this is rather unconventional, but can I just have a brief show of hands of anyone who came to Hatchard's? 1, 2, 3, oh well that's all right. Some of the people who were at Hatchard's will probably have heard what I'm going to say, one or two of the things before, but let me say that this week has been rather a dress rehearsal. You're getting the first performance, and this is my #1 dancing bear suit. So, with that, let me just start. It has been nearly 30 years in the writing, for reasons which I have just explained to you. But apart from the obvious reason of looking into the facts and making sure they were all correct, the origins of it, I was never intending to write this book. It wasn't something which I desperately wanted to write. It wasn't something in my blood that I was going to defend the family or anything like that. It was a book which came about for this reason. I went abroad in 1969 and lived in Beirut. My father had died 3 years before, significantly only 2 months after the repeal of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which put his own father in prison. It's an interesting fact, isn't it? 2 months only after the law had been repealed. And when I went abroad, my mother, as the executrix of his estate, took over. When I came back, I found her all of a fluster. She was talking about, oh, those academics. And she would get a request from an academic author to quote from Oscar's letters, and she would pass it on to a solicitor who would charge the academic £5 for the permissions fee and charge my mother 10 for doing it. So it was rather a bad deal altogether. So I decided that I was going to take over. But what I found, to my disappointment, is that my mother was firmly stuck in a pre-Wolfenden, pre-Gay Pride, pre-Carnaby Street, pre-repeal of the Criminal Law Amendment Act and she was determined at all costs to enjoy Oscar Wilde and get the public to enjoy Oscar Wilde on her own terms. And this meant that she would get her whitewash brush out and whitewash anything which she found distasteful or did a disservice to the family. Well, at this point, Richard Ellman came into my life. He was pointed in my direction by Rupert Hart Davis, with whom he had a long correspondence. And Rupert said, well, you can approach Mrs. Holland. She has nothing left in the way of documents or archives. You can approach her husband, her son, who knows very little. And Richard Ellman invited me to lunch at Oxford. And I found him thoroughly sympathetic. It was perfectly clear to me that he was going to write what was the definitive biography of Oscar Wilde for the time. And it all went quiet for, something like 10 years, until he came back into my life in 1986. And at that point, my mother said to me, did you know that Richard Ellman, I'm not going to press this point because I think Rupert Everett was a little bit too insistent on it yesterday about the whole question of syphilis and Oscar Wilde, and as I think most of you as Wildians here will know, that it's the fact that Oscar is supposed to have died of it is pretty much now disproved by very eminent medical men and STD specialists and so on. And it was one of the few occasions on which I took my mother's part, and I felt that this needed somehow either to be proved beyond, well, it's always of course difficult to prove a negative philosophically, but at least it could be laid out with reasonable conjecture, so that one could say it is highly probable that. But this is perfectly obviously not the case. And anyway, I've gone into the history of how I disputed the fact with Dick Ellman. I enjoyed his company, I admired his scholarship, and I got on well with him. And I gave him quite a lot of information from papers which my mother had without telling her. There was a time then when my mother, if I ever collaborated with a biographer or in some form on a work on Oscar Wilde, she would refer to it as fraternizing with the enemy. And anyway, on this case, I felt very strongly about it. I've told you all this simply to say that for 2 weeks, sort of night and day, in and out of the British Library, I researched as much as I possibly could the history of the gossip of Oscar and syphilis. What it taught me was, reading around the subject, that the amount of myth-making, lies, misrepresentations, imaginative reconstructions of the past and so on, surrounding the posthumous history of Oscar Wilde was enormous. And I thought, it's about time that somebody wrote a book exploding all these myths, and that is where it all started. So it's taken all that time to go through the archives. I can't remember how many it has been to date, but it has been across America, across Europe, obviously in England as well, and with the help of many friends and academics in those countries. Let me just go back a little way to the myths and the false memories, the polishing of images, the money-making, and the tying up of loose ends. And that is what all these myths are really all about. People who wanted to polish their image for posterity, people who had a friendship and association with Oscar Wilde, who wanted in their memoirs of the 1920s to show, for example, how much they supported him when the crash came, which of course, with the research that I was able to do and the letters which passed among their friends, for example, was perfectly obviously untrue. Then there was the question of money. Now that comes in much later. The filmmakers who wanted to say sensational things in order to put bums on seats in cinemas. The filmmakers who would, for example, in the case of the two films of the 1960s, they were anodyne almost beyond belief. Constance meeting Oscar out of prison in a carriage and putting a green carnation into his buttonhole and waving him off to the continent at Victoria Station. I mean, what could be further from the real truth than that? Then the Stephen Fry film, in which Stephen had all the intellectual quality, all the stature physically. I think he represented Oscar extremely well. The only thing was that I felt that Stephen, with his knowledge of Oscar, was anticipating already, right at the start, what was going to come. It was rather like Oscar writing after prison, "My cradle was rocked by the fates." And I think that Stephen played the early Oscar a little bit as the cradle being rocked by the fates. But there again, if you'll forgive the vulgarity of it, I discovered that the Japanese, who had invested quite a large sum of money in the film, had insisted that there was a lot of bum going on in the film, and they got it. Sheila Coleman, who read the script in the end, said that she was shocked by this foul-mouthed representation of young Bosie Douglas, of who she was by then the executrix. And she said that she did admit, though, that Jude Law was the perfect Bosie, and I agree with her. But again, it was a matter of putting bums on seats. Rather sadly, I've always said to these filmmakers, you can give the public if you give the public what they're expecting, you can throw in a lot more that they're not expecting. But if you don't give them what they are expecting, then they won't forgive you for the rest. It was a life sensational in itself, and it doesn't require over-sensationalizing. The story that I've told has, and I'm only going to go into the beginning part of it, the story that I've told has a lot of misconceptions. I think I referred to this last year in a talk which I gave shortly before proposing his health. The question of Oscar, I will do it again briefly, very briefly, the question of Oscar and Constance getting back together again after prison. Most biographers, in what I call follow my leader biography, have copied each other and simply said, oh, well, Constance, you know, she hesitated and listened to her advisors, and she didn't really want to get back with him at that stage, and so on. They both, and I have enough proof in the book, as you will see, particularly a letter from the novelist Henrietta Stannard to a friend of hers, saying that Constance desperately wanted to get back and see Oscar. They didn't get back because Constance did hesitate, and she hesitated because she listened to her advisors. But why did she listen to her advisors? And I'll tell you exactly why. Because they were all hypocrites. They told her to leave Oscar, to find his feet, a little period of probation, my dear, just leave him alone, that'll be fine. Once he'll need to settle down. And the reason for doing it? Quite simply because if Mr. and Mrs. Wilde, then undivorced, had got back together, it would have been, for society on the continent, a terrible quandary. How could they possibly ostracize Constance because she got back together with her husband, who was a criminal, bankrupt, and a homosexual? So the best thing to do is just keep them apart on the basis that Oscar needed to find his feet. Anyway, worse, I'm afraid, was to be found in my dad's autobiography. The fact that Constance took her children to the continent, but was turned out of a hotel because the hotel keeper felt that it would be bad for business that the family of Oscar Wilde was under his roof. Some time ago, I went to the University of Lausanne to give a lecture at I beg your pardon, it was to play the part of Oscar in my little playlet, the cross-examination of Oscar Wilde. In younger days, I played his part in that playlet of mine, and I went to Montreux, just down the Lake of Geneva, to the archives in a sort of spirit of in the footsteps of research. And I found in the archives in Montreux an extremely helpful archivist who I put the question to. And she said, oh, well, all you have to do is to consult what was called Le Journal des Étrangers. And it was a weekly newspaper which gave the movements of every foreign person who came and went from the hotels. And the Wilde family stayed in the same hotel the whole time that they were there. How do you explain this? And she said, oh, well, of course, the Hôtel du Parc at that stage had just bought the Nestlé summer house in the mountains and turned it into an annex. And it seems highly probable, and we looked it up in the journal, that the Wilde family had been moved out from the main hotel into the annex because they were late bookers. And I thought, how do we explain this? And it was then perfectly obvious to me. They were never turned out of the hotel, but in 1953, when my father started to write his autobiography, the feeling of shame, of rejection, that something was wrong in his family and that the hotel had moved them out of the main hotel was so strong, still, 58 years later, that he felt that they had been thrown out of the hotel by the proprietor. The evidence was there that they hadn't been, so why did he think it? And that is the conclusion I came to. I'll challenge anybody to prove me wrong, but I think it is the only solution. My father didn't have access to the internet, or he wasn't going to go to Switzerland and do the research himself. The other thing which my father, and this is a part of the third myth-making inventions and exaggerations that I had to deal with, was my father saying that he met Helen Carew, which he did indeed meet Helen Carew, who was a good friend of Robbie Ross. And he met her because of a fellow student at a crammer's that he had gone to in Covent Garden, who took him home to his mother, Helen Carew, and Helen Carew introduced him to Robbie Ross. My father maintains that Helen Carew gave the money for Oscar's tomb because she was a very close friend of Oscar's, and when he went to see Helen Carew, she showed him all the wonderfully inscribed copies that Oscar had given her. Where are the copies? Helen Carew left her whole estate to young Freddie Smith, who was one of Robert Ross's so-called secretaries. But Freddie knew all about, Freddie became a sort of protege of Helen Carew. Freddie knew all about Oscar Wilde. Freddie knew the value of such things. And if he'd had them, he would have kept them. Books have a habit of having accidents, but you don't have an accident with a whole library of books which have been given to you by Oscar Wilde. And the letters, which obviously, if she'd been such a close friend of Oscar Wilde's, have never appeared either. Why not? Well, it's difficult to prove either way that they didn't, the letters and the books didn't exist. But what I, with the help of a very good scholar, Tom Wright, whose book, Built of Books, an investigation into Oscar's reading habits, was very kind enough to share with me Oscar's membership of the 80 Club, which was a club which they had Parnell as a speaker at one stage. They were very much in favour of Irish independence, the Irish nationalists, and Helen Carew's second husband was an ardent Irish nationalist. She married him in the early 1890s. He died prematurely in the early 1900s, and my conjecture has been that without any evidence whatsoever that Oscar and Helen Carew knew each other, Helen Carew offered the money for Oscar's tomb to commemorate her own late nationalist husband, and Robbie's advice to give something to him for the memory of Oscar. So she was commemorating Robbie's friend and her own dead husband, who had spent time in jail, as it did, I have to say, in the 1890s, and died a premature death under, I suppose, considerable stress from his persecution by the English. These are the things which made me, they gave me a terrible pang of conscience that I should be saying that my father had exaggerated or invented. But this second example that I've given you is one of tying up loose ends. How do you explain that Helen Carew gave the money for Oscar's tomb? Quite simply that they were very good friends, and Helen Carew wanted to commemorate her old friend. Full stop. You have to back this up. So you see in her library copies of the books which your father had signed to her. They've disappeared. Oh, and the letters which they exchanged because they were such good friends, never seen again. George Kennard, Helen Carew's grandson, wrote a book in sometime, I think it was in the 1990s. He was a very colourful army figure, and he claimed, probably on the basis of what my father had said about seeing all these inscribed copies, of seeing a copy of The Happy Prince in his grandmother's library, inscribed "To the happy princess from the unhappy prince." I mean, a more terrible pastiche of Oscar's style is difficult to imagine, but it's what I suppose one has to call a perfect example of follow my leader biography. You pick up on somebody else's bad research or exaggeration or whatever you like to call it, you repeat it, and with another repeat after that, it then becomes enshrined in fact. And that is what I've tried to combat. I'll give you one further example, and that is of the polishing of personalities for posterity. Gladys Palmer was the daughter of Walter and Jean Palmer. Walter was one of the owners of Huntley and Palmer's biscuit factory at Reading. And the Wildes used to go down there fairly regularly and even leave their children with the Palmers. And the Palmers had a daughter called Gladys, who, as my father said, ruled the nursery with a rod of iron. She was slightly older than them, and in the late 1920s, she had a book ghosted for her in which she maintained that at some stage around the time of Oscar's trials, Uncle Oscar, as she called him, and she was obviously very fond of him, there's no doubt about that, Uncle Oscar came in a terrible state to her father to ask for money for his trial. And her father gave him a lot of moral support and money, and they were terribly kind to him. Well, now if you turn it over every which way, you can realize how absurd this claim was. One, Oscar wouldn't have asked for money for his trial because Edward Clark, the barrister, represented him pro bono. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Walter Palmer almost certainly wouldn't have had anything. You couldn't have seen him for dust, I should think, the moment Oscar had been arrested and was on remand, because Walter Palmer was wanting to get the nomination for the Conservative candidate, or whatever it called in those days, I can't remember, for Reading. So if he had been seen to be a supporter of Oscar Wilde, I should think whatever happened in those days about selection committees would have thrown him out at once. So all the conjectural evidence is entirely against it. Oh yes, and one other thing. She says that Oscar and her mother exchanged letters, and he would refer to her as Moonbeam 1, and she would refer to him as Moonbeam 2. I mean, can you imagine anything more unlikely? No, it's not possible. Anyway, enough of that. I don't want to go on too long. I could tell you all sorts of stories about the research that I've done and the surprising, mind-boggling sometimes, facts that I have discovered which disprove so much of what has been written posthumously about Oscar. Lily Langtry, for example, when Oscar was sent to prison, was asked about him. He said, oh, he was a terrible bore anyway. But by the 1920s, when she was living in the south of France, she always kept a spare place at her dining room table for dear Oscar. I'm going to finish up tonight just by giving you a couple of small examples of the things which aren't in the book. The book was long enough as it was. An old American friend of mine, before he died, said to me, and he said, when are you going to finish your book? And I said, well, when it's finished, when I've done all the research. And he said, I think you should get up every morning and say to yourself as a mantra, leave something for other people to find. And that really is what I've done. But there are, just quickly, a couple of things that I thought I'd share with you. I'm not an unbeliever in the psychics, in the supernatural. But equally, I'm not a fervent believer in it either. But I'm just going to give you two very short examples of things which aren't in the book, but which I find slightly, spine-chilling is not the word because that's negative, but slightly goosebumpy. When I came back from abroad, I had to find myself somewhere to live. And scanning the personal columns in those days as they were of the Times and the Standard, I found a room to let in Kensington Square. I rang the number and it was engaged all day long. And eventually I got through and a very tired voice said, yes. I said, it's about the room. I said, you've had so many calls, I expect it's gone. But if you don't mind my saying so, I think it's much too cheap. And there was a sort of pause. And she said, well, you're obviously looking for somewhere. I have a studio at the bottom of my garden. It's not very comfortable and sort of cold in winter and hot in summer, but would you like to come and look at it? And I said, well, yes, I'd love to. And within a few hours, I'd agreed a price and she let me have her studio. And that's where I lived for 3 years. When my mother died, that was in 1975 to 1977. And when my mother died, I had access to all my father's papers, and amongst them was a photograph, which I have put into the little Wilde Album, of Uncle Cyril sitting rather sort of uncomfortably in a chair in front of a door, a big mahogany panelled door. And on the side of him is, some of you will remember that rather ghastly sort of raffia wallpaper which people used, which was frightfully popular sometime in the 1960s. And I looked at this photograph and I thought, that's terribly familiar. And I turned it over, and on the back, it was Fred Hollier, photographer, number 9 Pembroke Square, which was my landlady's house. And I sat for 3 years looking at the door in front of which Uncle Cyril had been photographed in about 1892. The other thing which I found slightly uncomfortable was when, on that trip to Montreux, I did the little playlet of Oscar and Edward Carson in cross-examination. We started the performance, and within 5 minutes there was a tremendous thunderstorm which blew all the lights. And we started again, and the performance went off perfectly well. And the following morning I rang my wife in France and I said, it went all well last night, but, and she interrupted me and she said, but what? She said, we last night at 8 o'clock, we had the most terrible thunderstorm here, and it blew all the lights, and it was our house was the only one in the village which was affected. And I said to her, that's very uncanny, but it was exactly the same time. And from that moment onwards, I took the part of Oscar again. I did it with Simon Callow once at the Old Bailey, and we raised money for some people called Fine Cell Work, which was rather extraordinarily encouraging prisoners to do needlework. You can imagine a great hefty convict doing needlework, but in many cases they went on and they made a living out of doing it. But anyway, from that moment onwards, I did continue in my younger days to play the part of Oscar, but I never, ever did it again for money. It was always done for charity, memorably thinking of that passage in De Profundis where he talks about the effect on him after prison, and he makes a very, very eloquent plea for the rehabilitation of offenders. And so I've always done it afterwards. I've stopped doing it now, I'm much too old, but I never did it again for money. Anyway, that's all I really want to say to you tonight, and I probably slightly overrun my time. Nevertheless, if any of you, I would like to say one thing. If any of you buy the book, please, tonight, open the book and lay it flat on a table, and you will find that it opens beautifully and you can read it without having to break the bloody back of it. And I insisted, no, let's say I persuaded my publishers to publish a book which had stitched signatures. And I said to them, not only is it pleasant to read, irrespective of the content, but to have a nice book in your hand, which is easy to read, you can read into the gutter of the book, so to speak, makes all the difference. And the second consideration, which I will finish up with tonight, is that the myths that I have tried to bust in this book are sitting on library shelves, published in 1910, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. In their covers, maybe slightly tatty, maybe sometimes rebound by the libraries. But if you get a perfect bound book, a terrible designation, which is for a book which is so imperfect as to be inaesthetic totally, where they fold the pages and chop off the back and put glue on it, and when they fall out, what does the library do? They try and find a new copy, but if there aren't any new copies, they're not going to cut the back off and glue it again, because then you can't open it at all. So they throw it away. And I wanted my book to stay on the library shelves, busting the myths for as long as the myths remain on those shelves. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Merlin's happy to answer a few questions. If anyone has a question, please wave. What's your question? Karen.
Merlin, I love and admire the reason that you wrote the book. I guess I'm thinking that you spent a large amount of time writing it, and I'm really intrigued to just ask you, what have you learned about yourself as Oscar's grandson? What have you learned about yourself through that process? Is there anything that you want to share with us?
Shall I repeat that? The question was, what has Merlin learned about himself from this long process of writing the book?
I think I've learned less about myself than I've learned about members of my family, which is not an answer to your question, really. People have said to me, with a very difficult question, have you inherited anything in the way of characteristics from your grandfather? And the answer is, I would hesitate to claim them, but there was one characteristic which I think my father inherited, and I think possibly I've inherited from him, which is that in misfortune, you shrug your shoulders and smile and move on. And it was a characteristic which my father had. It was certainly a very strong characteristic which Oscar had in his last years. And I quoted that wonderful letter to Frankie Forbes Robertson to you last year, I think, where he says, I can't get to you, miles of land, miles of sea, the purple of mountains and the silver of rivers divide us. I'm supposed to live on a few francs a day. I'm supposed to live on a few francs a day. I am, like St. Francis of Assisi, I am wedded to poverty. But in in my case, the marriage is not a success. I mean, it has humour, beauty, sadness, it has everything. And that, I think, is something which my father had at his last days, which was the ability to smile and shrug your shoulders and sort of get on with it. I don't think I've inherited other things from him. I was talking to Johnny Falber this evening about writing to people. He said, you get a lot of letters from people. And I said, well, I do actually, yes. But I have to answer them. I become a sort of amanuensis, and I think back to Oscar writing to people who wrote, answering letters from people who wrote to him, and doing it with good grace. And it's not something I want to claim that I've inherited from him. I haven't. It's something which I feel is courtesy and kindness. And if somebody writes, the number of times, let me just say that the number of times that I go to Père Lachaise, I don't go there often and I don't go there on purpose, but if I'm in Paris, I'll go and give the tomb a look over. And there are always little billets doux stuck underneath the glass. And please, it's not perspex, it's toughened glass. And for the most part, I think 50% of them say something along the lines of, thank you. I was in a terrible state. I read De Profundis another time, and it made all the difference to my life. Thank you. I mean, it's extraordinary. There's one I think I mentioned on the radio the other day. A little note from somebody which said, here are 2 cigarettes, one for you and one for Robbie. I hear they don't sell them in heaven. Love, I can't remember who it was. But again, I can't reply to those, but I think people who do write need a reply. You'll find a story in the book about an extraordinary Austrian schoolgirl to whom I replied 30 years ago when she came to London and looked at Oscar's head opposite Charing Cross. My God, she said, he's alive. She saw it when it was being cast. We corresponded for a bit. She is now a full professor at Vienna University and a fellow of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and Literature. And she owes her, she keeps saying to me, and I feel very embarrassed by it, she said, if you haven't replied to my letter, I might not be here. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's a very long answer to your question.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I tell my little story, Vanessa? What I was saying
A question, really, if you can, Wanda. You can ask your questions
I work
after.
with young children in a nursery, and every year we do the Selfish Giants, and we encourage sharing and kindness, and we have a history box with the giant's clothes in. We have a little giant puppet, flowers, we make a garden, and the children absolutely love it. And then last year, I needed a little boy doll to go with the story. And I'm searching through a charity shop and I find a little boy doll and I turn it over and the label, like you were saying before about being spiritual, when I turn that doll over on the label, he's called Oscar. I could not have picked a perfect boy doll to go with the story, but maybe I have picked it.
Thank you, Marie. Any other questions? Serge.
Good evening. What do you think, about the so-called moving images on the YouTube clip of Oscar walking in Paris during the exhibition in 1900? Is that genuine or not? What's your feeling? And secondly, is the wax cylinder recording of his voice genuine or not? What's your feeling?
Well, I can answer the second one. The wax cylinder recording of his voice, first of all, it was examined by the British Institute of Recorded Sound when they were in Exhibition Road, before they became part of the British Library, and 2 of the technicians there were listening to the recording, and they said that the frequencies of the recording and of the recording needle were 2 so incompatible things that it had to be a forgery. They've got, I think now in the British Library, the the records, the shellac in those days, 1950s records, onto which this Edison cylinder was transferred. And the other thing they said is that in order to move the diaphragm of an Edison recording machine, which recorded onto the wax cylinder, you had to bellow into the thing in order to make it move, and that's not what Oscar is doing, or so-called Oscar is doing. As to the images, these are AI-generated images, I think, aren't they? Is that what you're talking about?
No. It's before AI. I saw these images. They've been on YouTube maybe 7, 8, 9 years at least.
But moving images.
There is a film, Merlin, of the French Exposition, and there's a character walking who some people think is Oscar.
Walking in a white suit with a hat, and a tall man, a good-looking man, not fat yet. He was fat.
I think if I had a tenner for everything like that which has been put in front of me, or in front of that matter of the Oscar Wilde Society, I'd be a very, very rich man. And the things which are put to the Oscar Wilde Society occasionally, I can remember having long correspondence with poor Don about these things. And in one case, when the Oscar Wilde Society said that they thought it was absolutely no question about it going to be an Oscar, and I confirmed their opinion, we were even threatened with legal action for denouncing these as forgeries.
My name is still on the website.
Is it?
I will be dragged through the courts.
2 of you will be dragged through the courts. It's on the website. Any last questions? We have one more. Tina?
Yes. Thank you for your talk. We know a lot of things about...
I can't hear you, Tina. I'm sorry. Can you stand up and...
Oh, yes. Thank you for your talk. We know a lot of things about your grandfather and your grandmother, but a few summers ago I was in Lisboa at the grave of your uncle. We don't know a lot of things about Cyril. Did you discover some things about his...
Tina is saying that we don't know very much about Cyril. Can you tell us something that you discovered about Cyril?
We know he died in war.
We know the bare facts, but is there anything about Cyril that you discovered that perhaps we didn't know before?
Yes. A lady called Margaret Stewart got in touch with me, who had letters addressed to her grandmother from Cyril, and she allowed me to see them. And they're letters addressed to her granny in terms of which I've not seen Cyril write before. He was obviously very much in love with her, and she was very fond of him. And the last letter says, "Can I come and see you? I promise not to be morbid." And a short time later, he went off to India for various reasons, as you will find in the book. But it was perfectly clear, and in her family, Margaret Stewart's family, it was always known that her aunt, also her grandmother, also Margaret, might have married Cyril. She too was an orphan. They had a common bond there, and you will find the story in the book. When Cyril was killed in 1915 on the front, his Sam Brown belt was sent back to England. I'm not quite sure why it wasn't given to my father, but presumably he had one himself. But it was sent back to England and hung over Margaret Maitland's chair for the rest of her life. And it still hangs over Margaret Stewart's chair to this day. So he did fall in love, and she fell in love with him, but she needed a rich husband. And Cyril, I don't think, was probably rich enough.
Thank you, Merlin. Well, thank you for that. If anyone has any other questions, please ask Merlin when he's signing books afterwards, but we have the last word from Don. Thank you so much, Merlin.
I'm looking round because it's wonderful to see everybody here in this, what has become our happy, recurring annual venue. And it is such a pleasure just to be here where Oscar and Constance both were, and in these Edwardian surroundings, which are very familiar to a lot of us, because they were the meeting place in a number of films, especially between the wars, of showing political intrigues between members of different political parties, and they met in mahogany-lined rooms, and they were often here. I think it was a useful source of income for the club to have this. Enough of this. Merlin, you gave us a really full understanding of Constance and the pressures which she was put upon, which were put upon her over the possibility of meeting Oscar again. It was very sad, deeply moving. And you gave us a deep understanding of what's been written posthumously by way of myth, exaggeration, and all the other pejorative words about Oscar thereafter. And all the myths, as you say, are lined up on library shelves and are occasionally taken down and quoted as fact. You told us too about memory, understanding, and I think that really was quite a deep insight, because you mentioned, I think, the possibility that when Vivian said that he remembered his father playing with them on the nursery floor, that it wasn't a regular thing, but it happened once, at least, and has been sort of extrapolated from there. And I think that's what one does with one's memories. A small memory is vivid, and it expands with thinking about it and telling it to other people. So, understanding memory is something which came, I think, from what you've written and what you said. A book that stays open, oh yes, what a wonderful thing. If I may say so, you didn't mention a serious culprit in all this, the Oxford University Press, whose books are a total disgrace to the book industry. And I don't think that many people would disagree with that. You have to heave them apart, and if you heave them apart, they crack in that nasty way where you know the spine is broken. So I thought I'd just throw in that. You ended up, I think, by saying that you had been advised and thought it was good advice to leave something for other people to discover. Well, I think you've left something for other people to discover, but I can't for the life of me think what it was, what it might be. And meanwhile, we are all enormously grateful to you, Merlin, for your sharing your understanding of Oscar and Constance and everything about them, about the myths and about the films and about the books and everything else. I think we understand it all a bit better, and we are waiting to see what else may be discovered in the future. Meanwhile, thank you so much for all you've done for Oscar and Constance. Thank you, Merlin.